This week we get to talk about deviance, conformity, crime, all of the things that put boundaries on our actions and sometimes even on our, our beliefs and the way in which we conduct ourselves. Michael Foucault, in this quote of the day, states that the individual is the product of power, and we all experience different levels of sanction, abiding by rules, norms, and conducts of behavior, some of which can be called deviant, meaning something that would maybe break a law or a norm or have some sort of a negative sanction. And then there's sometimes where we are conforming, and so sometimes when we do that, we receive even positive sanctions, things that say that we are doing things in a correct manner. The textbook says that deviance is the modes of action that do not conform to the norms and values held by most members of a group or society. The difficulty with this is that so many parts of our world are segregated into different types of groups, and we have to know the rules and the norms and the culture of each one of those groups to know how to behave or to allow ourselves to at least try. Sometimes in conflict behavior, for example, we will often say some of those rules are biased and or do not give a correct interpretation of how we should keep the law, but we'll talk about that in a little bit. The most important thing I think you need to know about deviance, and watch the video on deviance that is from the OSU professor, and it's uploaded. I think that would be really helpful for you to see. He mentions that, for example, deviance can be different by state. He lifts up the fact that in Oklahoma, if you had a tattoo up till 2006, you probably didn't get that in the state of Oklahoma because it was illegal to do so. So we saw a lot of people that wanted to get a tattoo go to parlors in nearby states and then come back. Of course, it wasn't illegal to have a tattoo. It was just illegal to get a tattoo in Oklahoma. Then after 2006, they passed a law about that. So what may look deviant in one area may not look completely deviant in another. And so it's impossible for everyone within a society to obey every rule because we're often crossing between different places, different cultures, different boundaries. What's important for us to recognize is that we will usually know if we've done something deviant because we not only have certain tells based on, for example, what we were talking about with social interaction a few weeks back, where people might look at you or stare. They may say something to you if it's crossing a line for them, and or you may not be received with welcome. That's usually how we know we're breaking some sort of a deviant behavior. Of course, if you cross the line with the law, you may receive a ticket. You could even end up going to jail. There are all different kinds of levels, and it's important to recognize again that changes by location. In the United States, we have 50 states, but we also have different counties with different laws. Different communities have different laws. And so we have to recognize that conforming is often knowing what those laws are, or at least finding them out. There are two types of deviance. First, there's a formal deviance and informal deviance. Formal involves actual negative sanctions, typically that involve fines or jail time, community service, expulsion, detention. I don't know if you ever went to detention in high school, but it was a sense of formally being assigned some time to be taken out of the norm and to actually do some sort of reparation for what you'd done. And even if it was just keeping you after school for a couple hours or making you be quiet, this was seen as a formal sanction that is often something that we will, as a young person, experience if we've broken rules in a school. Informal is more the sense of getting the feeling that you're doing something wrong or being shamed or shunned. Sometimes you'll have family disapproval. Someone will say something to you and say, that's just not the way we do things, or you could even be grounded to the point of, you know, not being able to go out. That's not something that's going to be on your record or seen as something official, but it is something you might remember. Norms are usually what it is that we are breaking when it comes to an informal type of deviance. meaning that there are rules of conduct that specify appropriate behavior in a given range of social situations. It's the do's and don'ts of society, and we've talked about that before. So sometime if you come home and put your feet up on the table after playing outside, or if you haven't taken a shower and you don't wash your hands and you touch food, you will quickly sometimes find people jumping into that kind of shunning behavior, or speaking to you about those do's and those don'ts, or even giving you hints like, hey, don't you want to go wash your hands before you touch the fruit, or before you pick up any kind of thing that's on the table. These are things that are often indications that we've crossed that line. Mores are a little bit closer to those cultural subtypes of norms that are widely adhered to, and they have a great moral social significance. So they're things that aren't just about normal behavior, but they're things that we think everybody does. For example, if you've seen a funeral procession, nobody actually has set into formal law that we're supposed to pull over in every state. It could be something that you could get in trouble for, but it's a typical idea that that funeral procession requires respect, and so we're trying to respect the family and those who are mourning, and so you'll pull aside, and you can tell that the more is being broken when people kind of even move their cars or try to connect people to move over, and you'll see turn signals go on, and sometimes lights flash so that people know that that's what they're supposed to do. And then things like even taking the hat off for the Pledge of Allegiance. We're seeing a lot of this with kneeling right now. There's a lot of people that it's not a formal law to not kneel, or not, or to put your hand over your heart or take off your hat. That's just something that's a more. That's an expected piece. However, as conflict theorists would say, and I would say this as well, that taking a knee is a sign of saying there's something going on here, and this is breaking a more on purpose so that people are aware of a social situation, which is often what we see in protest, especially when it comes to what we see people willing to do to be able to use their deviant behavior to bring some injustice to light, or something to that effect. Therefore, we have to also recognize that normal behavior is really in quotes when it comes to the law, because we all know that there are laws that we break every day. If you ever speed, you're breaking the law. If you don't look at all of the state's laws, you may be breaking a law if you don't turn your wipers on when the rainstorms come, because in Missouri, you're supposed to turn on your lights and your wipers, and you could be pulled over for that. Whereas in the state of Kansas, that's not required. So there's lots of normal behavior that might be based on location, and knowing all of those laws at the same time aren't something that we possibly can do. What is abnormal is often asked as a question also when we're looking at norms and conformity. If something is normal someplace, it may not be abnormal in other places. Think about the college setting. If you come to college and you see all kinds of different types of hairstyles and different types of clothing, you may not really think too much about any of that because it's expected. It's a normal behavior for students to experiment and to consider looking into their self-identity. But if you're from a town that might be rural and typically has a small population, you'll see a lot of the times the same type of clothing, the same type of hairstyles, and that is normal behavior for there. And so if a college student comes home from college and they've changed their hair color and they're wearing different clothes, maybe even they're dating somebody that, or being with people that is not the same sexuality, their sexuality is something they're asking questions about, so they may be dating somebody of the same sex. There are all kinds of things that suddenly impose into the normal behavior of that rural community that would have been normal behavior for college. So what's permissible, what's criminal is often seen differently. criminal is something that's sanctioned by law, and permissible is something that we see typically involved in those mores and the breaking of norms. Therefore, a sanction, which is both something that can be positive or negative, is often in play, telling you where or how your behavior is being accepted as normal or abnormal. And most of the time when we hear the word sanction, we think of it in a negative way. For example, there are things in the videos, we'll share this as well, where sanction for violence is going to be usually negative, as well as jail and fines, even being grounded. Those can be negative sanctions because it's trying to keep you, the societal norms and the institutions that are assigned that work of keeping people within those boundaries are given the permission to create those sanctions. So our governments, our law enforcement, whether or not those are being done in a completely fair and just way is also something that sociology looks at heavily. And there are some times where we see much bias. For example, Black Lives Matter would often say, hey, the representation of the Black population in jail is overrepresented. And so these sanctions are being biased about a particular community. So to know that, yes, this is the action, is the sanction, but it doesn't mean that there can't be pushback from the community, say, hey, there are some behaviors that need to be corrected here as far as how we're trying people, or even if people are getting a trial. And so we see these sanctions, but we also evaluate them and see at this time, for example, we're seeing a lot of this in the news where people are questioning whether those given the authority for these sanctions or the way in which we're doing these sanctions is fair and just across the board. And therefore, we see the highest level of sanction being deemed a crime. If something is deemed a crime, it's an active action that countervenes the laws established by a political authority. Now, if you're punished by your parents by receiving grounding because you showed up late from being out with friends, that's not a crime. That is, you're breaking a law, or you're not breaking a law, you're breaking a more or a norm of your family. Now, some of you may actually say, in my family, it felt like a crime. And there are times where that shunning is much part of a parent's way of sanctioning. However, there are some times where you'll break a norm or a more, and your parents may have been ones that talked to you more about it and try to get you to see things a little differently and reform that behavior in a different way than grounding. Crimes, on the other hand, usually come with some sort of labeling that makes you possibly labeled as a criminal. And there are lots of crimes out there. We talk about, obviously, rape and rape culture. We're constantly dealing with the ways in which people, especially as we're looking at the Kavanaugh material and whether there's sexual assault, different types of things. This is in our news every single day. And so whether it's labeled a crime is important because it changes the label of the person. Breaking and entering, disorderly conduct, there are different levels of crime that receive different levels of punishment. And there's a lot of times in our current day and age where we're more aware of that than we have been in previous generations due to the internet. We are able to see things online about crime and different levels of it. I even watch a show or listen to a podcast called Serial. Some of you may have listened to that before. And I feel like I know more than my parents do about everyday stories in crime based on that. But, you know, it's interesting as we see that age of the internet shape how we look at the law, that we may not have had that much resource in the past. So it's kind of interesting. And therefore, that also shapes how we look at law. Knowing our politicians are making laws and it's being enforced. Usually those politicians are, elected by the citizenship and those who are able to then be in that political power, create these laws, run the gamut, depending on whether it's local law, county, state, federal. All of these have different levels. But a law is a rule or behavior established by a political authority and backed by state power in some form or another. So once again, the speed limit can be determined sometimes state by state. And so you may feel like you can go extremely fast in certain parts of Texas where, for example, on the west side of Texas, the speed limit's 80 miles an hour. But you may hit parts of western Kansas or even eastern Kansas where it slows down to 65, and that's all based on what the state has deemed as the speed limit. Drinking age is something that is set on a federal level. And so at one time, drinking age was 18, and then sometime in the 80s, it went to 21. And then there's different ways of dealing with the law, whether or not somebody is actually breaking it or not. Sometimes, for example, we can see clear evidence of stealing, for example, where somebody may have thought they were borrowing something and they're being brought to task for that. So there's different levels of law. And if you're interested in criminology, we have a great department here at Emporia State, and some of you may be involved in that. I highly recommend thinking about even the criminology club because you learn more about all of these, including the reinforcement theories and all the things that we do to involve reward and punishment when we're thinking about how we keep these norms and also our place in that. First of all, we think about behavior learned through association with others and how we ourselves learn about how we engage in either crime or deviant behavior. That's often called differential association. Those who you're around makes a difference. I was a pretty, for example, fearless kid, and so sometimes I could get other people in trouble at school because I break a rule here or there, but that wasn't a crime. But I often noticed that teachers sometimes would keep an eye on our group because we would often be more ornery than other people in the classroom. Now, a lot of people studying differential association may keep eye on those types of groups because maybe they might engage in crime depending on how fearless they are. Also, there's a lot of study about people and the ability for them to be able to survive and needing levels of breaking the law to be able to survive. There's a lot of community studies that say there's higher crime rates in places where they don't have more resources. And so we do see higher crime because people are trying to survive. There's lots of ways in which we look at that. So we have to both look at the groups, but also understand what's going on behind them. Using this theory, we see that people deviate from societal norms because of that association and their own social realities, which may differ from social norms. So let's say there's a huge impact on people who are not with food in their area. We're seeing a lot of food deserts, for example, and people cannot afford the basics. And so sometimes we see deviant behavior. For example, there's a lot to be said about the fact that in southeast Kansas, there's a large amount of food desert issue going on. And at the same time, there's a large level of meth production. We tend to see in poorer counties higher levels of meth. What's going on there is something we would think about by association. People learn to turn the other cheek, knowing in their own communities that, yes, this may be breaking the law, but they also know that this is something that goes on in the countrysides, and they try to avoid it. So we see ourselves basically seeing the different levels of boundary that each person is navigating, but also whole communities as a whole may actually allow for certain things to go on or not even have the resources to be able to deal with it. They also, when we studied this theory, we perceive the comparison of normal as different. It's different to have normal going on in rural or suburban areas sometimes than urban areas. It's a different norm when you're growing up in a different economic situation. So this is where the law, we see it overlaid over all of it as right or wrong, but then there's all these different areas in between that have to be thought about. Functionalists would approach this and dealing with all these multi-layered ways in which we deal with norms, mores, crime, and law, and how we sanction each area of that through the use of control theory, where the outcome of that imbalance between the impulses toward criminal activity or breaking a law or a boundary and what controls and deters it is something that basically assumes that criminals are rational beings who will act to maximize their own reward unless they're rendered unable to do so. And so you're trying to create as many sanctions to make people not take that route, to either have the consequences be high enough that the person would consider that that does not maximize their reward, and also to consider as rational beings that they will maximize their reward by being also not only keepers of the law, but also people who will pass that on to others. There are some issues with this because we know lots of people take that risk, and I've known people personally who have taken major risks when it comes to the law. Friends from high school that I hear about later that were caught in drug transactions, or people who I've known in certain settings that maybe broke into a place or even with violent acts. This is what control theory will say, is that they thought there was a greater reward for that risk. This doesn't always take into account, once again, what's going on in the communities or in the person's personal life. And so sometimes this has, again, a lot of critique, and the critique that typically comes into play is what we call conflict theory, which is often the theory that across the board with sociology will often be in debate with those that are functionalists. And the conflict theorists will argue that deviance is deliberately chosen, and it's often political in nature because certain groups receive different levels of bias and less levels of resource and less support to keep their community safe or to be able to live up to the norm that's expected. So, for example, when we talk about Black Lives Matter, this uprising is against society where authority and power has ended up institutionally creating areas of racism and discrimination. That's the argument, is that this is so institutional that to be able to keep the expected norm of, being treated, being able to keep that law, they're already labeled as criminals. Sometimes that is the part that is expected of certain communities, especially of those of Black and brown skin. And so Black Lives Matter would say, yeah, there are different advantages that you might be thinking about, that the criminal is rational, but it's also that the system is not rational in thinking about this. So once again, we compare both of those with also symbolic interactionists who kind of go in between the two and say labels are playing a big piece in how people think about themselves as either keeping the law or being deviant. Labeling theory and there is a great video on that. Please watch the labeling video because I'm going to use that for your discussion this week. People become deviant because certain labels are attached to their behavior. And so they live into that label. For example, how many times when you were a kid were you labeled and you lived into something based on that label, or you reacted to it? I remember I'm blonde haired, so a lot of times people would make blonde jokes. And I shouldn't think that would have made a big difference, except I often found myself thinking that I was ditzy or silly, or didn't have brains. You know, there was a lot of times that those type of um, simple comments and labels made a difference on how I looked at myself. This could also be when you're a young person, you know, you're expected to be a jock or you're expected to be a certain role, and we take on those labels. So the label of criminal is sometimes something we have to look at. For example, what does that do to your behavior if you're labeled a criminal for the rest of your life, a thug, an extremist? And we're not trying to judge right or wrong behavior, but we're just trying to see what happens with that. And in the video this week, it does talk about a woman who has cancer and wants to relieve herself from the pain through the use of marijuana, but the state in which she lives doesn't legalize that, but a state next to her does, and or nearby to her does, and so she would be labeled a criminal in the state that she lives because of purchasing that, but in a state 2 states away, she would not be considered a criminal. So this is important for us to keep in mind. Once again, going through all those, the functionalists, the conflict and labeling theory through symbolic interactionism helps us to really look at how these different levels of crime or norm violation play out. We also see a lot of times large crime not be sanctioned negatively. In fact, we just assume that it's normal behavior, that white-collar crime goes on. The crash in 2008 was due to white-collar crime, and people basically taking advantage of others, selling property, housing market, all of that was not going to pan out in the loans in the long run. Criminal activities carried out by those in white-collar or professional jobs, like fraud, embezzlement, the Ponzi scheme is kind of, you know, that fake money up front. Sure, we have jail time for that, but we often see that label, not that type of person labeled as a criminal, not as negatively associated as other crimes. And so that's something that we need to think about as sociologists, and especially in criminology. You look at, you know, why is it that that type of level crime associated usually with a higher status, a higher socioeconomic level, is different than someone who is in Southeast Kansas that is growing marijuana. And so these are always something that we compare, the types of crimes. Corporate crime is often large corporations in society breaking rules that have been set on federal levels, often pollution, false advertising, violation of health and safety. I just heard something about this recently where in England, a young girl, the packaging on the labels of the food were not properly packaged. She was highly allergic to sesame and had been ground into the food, and they had no way of knowing it, and she died. And that type of action is something that we see on the large scale. Sure, we once again know that we're going to expect some level of this, but again, corporate crime is something that does happen and is sanctioned very differently. Often it's sanctioned via taxes and or paying some sort of reparation to those that were affected. Cybercrime is growing more and more, and we hear about this all the time where there are scams where I just heard about this one the other day where a woman believed that she was dating Bruce Springsteen, and that they had found some sort of a connection online, and he was going to leave his wife for her, and he was asking for money for her, and she believed it. Now, I know that can sound naive, but this type of thing goes on all the time. We see this happen especially with elderly populations, where there are networks involving the information technologies where people are not just hacked, but they're taken advantage of. And these are very difficult for us to figure out how to sanction, because we can't often find the source of that activity, but we definitely are seeing more crime divisions created with cybercrime as the goal to try to be able to create some sort of a negative sanction that will stop that. There's also lots of subcultures where we've talked about this before, subcultures where values and norms are distinct to that group. For example, think about the mafia or gangs, deviant subcultures where we know they exist, and in some ways we know that there are sanctions that go on, but there's also a lot of negotiation that goes on as well. Subcultures such as in Vegas, we see prostitution, and it's illegal there, and yet it's kind of the subculture that on the larger national scale, we see more sanctions held for prostitution. So these subcultures are something that are very interesting because they often ride the line of, you know, whether something is a crime or knowing that something is criminal behavior, but that because there's a whole subculture involved, that it has to be nuanced differently in how law enforcement deals with that. So we expect, again, these deviant subcultures to exist. You know, sometimes we even glorify it. There's times where when you see some of the movies, even the historical movies, that the outlaws are often seen as the heroes. And that's that subculture that we have kind of in our background. We know that deviance will happen. Sometimes, however, and there's a video of Chief Community Partnership Chair in Baltimore, Melvin Russell. I invite you to watch that video as well, because community policing can be seen, you know, as something that feels a bit invasive sometimes to some people, like too many people looking out for each other may cause labeling based on different races and ethnicities, and different socioeconomic levels. And so that's sometimes the negative that we see of that. He gives kind of an idea of working with the communities to learn crime prevention together and to reintegrate policing with the community, but to also recognize that people need to get to know each other as neighbors. They need to get to know each other as people in a community that do have diverse challenges, and that the minute that we see those resources open up, that people gain more trust of each other. And so community policing is usually where it's a renewed emphasis on crime, but we've got to make the distinction between community policing and vigilantism, which vigilantism is taking that law into your own hands and often ending in a negative way with somebody sometimes even committing murder because they felt like they were protecting a community. They're two totally different things. Watch the video and you'll get an idea of some of that. This is the last thing, is one of the largest ways in which we deal with crime and deviance is shaming. It's what we do. It's a way of punishing a criminal and a deviant based on rituals of public disapproval. This can be very difficult. One thing in the literature about people who have served time is that almost 50% of them, if they do get a job, under $10,000 a year, and many of them don't reintegrate into the community. That shaming is something that continues to create a label, and sometimes that works negatively when we're thinking about reform. You know, being able to help somebody, especially if it's a young person that committed a crime and was incarcerated, and then the ability for them to reintegrate into the new society or the world that they leave after that incarceration, is often a continued shaming that just never gives them a chance to reform or come back into the community. So there are ways in which shaming, we've all experienced it, we all do it, but there's also some ways in which we recognize that it is some of the most difficult part for people to overcome, and we shame differently. You know, we shame, for example, if a fraternity hazes and actually causes harm to somebody, it's probably not going to land on a record for a really long time, versus a young person being expected to join a gang and do some sort of deviant behavior and then have that labeled onto them. So this week, what I invite you to think about is, are there things that you've done that you've broken the law for? Was it something that you were shamed in? Did you actually have to deal with the justice system? Do you think that there are things that you do every day that might, do speed, or are you a person that always walks across the um, the crosswalk, or do you jaywalk sometimes? These are things that are all part of that normative behavior that we also know that we cross on a regular basis. If you need me for anything, again, my cell phone is 913-553-0267, and I hope you have a good week. Looking forward to your posts.